Dr. Kemal Dervis is Vice President and Director of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. Before that, he was Executive Head of the United Nations Development Program and Chair of the United Nations Development Group, a committee consisting of the heads of all the UN funds, programs, and departments working on development issues at the country level. In 2001 to 2002, as Minister of Economic Affairs and the Treasury of Turkey, the Honorable Dr. Dervis was responsible for launching Turkey's successful recovery that Isa just referred to from a devastating financial crisis. From the end of 2002 to the summer of 2005, he was a member of the Turkish Parliament, representing his native city of Istanbul. During that period, he was one of 2 Turkish representatives to the Convention of the Future of Europe. Others may know of Dr. Dervis from his 22-year career at the World Bank, where he became Vice President for the Middle East and North Africa in 1996, and Vice President for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management in 2000. At the World Bank, he also managed work on the transition of Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, trade and financial sector policies in emerging markets, and the reconstruction of Bosnia. In the past few years, Dr. Dervis has been participating in various international and European task forces and networks. Dr. Dervis earned his bachelor and master's degrees in economics from the London School of Economics and his PhD from Princeton. He taught at Princeton and in the Middle East technical universities before joining the World Bank. Dr. Dervis is also a member of the Board of Overseers of Sabancı University in Istanbul and will contribute to the work of that university, particularly on the European enlargement issues. He has published many articles in academic journals as well as current affairs publications. His most recent book, A Better Globalization, was published by Brookings Press for the Center for Global Development in 2005. Dr. Dervis is fluent in English, Turkish, French, and German. So if you speak one of those languages, you're going to have a good time tonight. Dr. Dervis is accompanied by his charming and intelligent wife, Kathy. So please welcome Dr. Dervis and Kathy Dervis to Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you.
Whether I'm following I just wanted to, make sure I can still step it up. Well, it's really a great pleasure to be here, and I really want to thank all of those who made this possible. The Istanbul Center sponsoring the event and having invited me for quite a few months, and I'm really happy now to be able to be here at the invitation of the Istanbul Center, but also the Georgia Humanities Council, and of course the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum, and the Turkish-American Chamber of Commerce of the Southeastern United States. It's really a privilege for me to be here, and I think when one thinks about events of this sort, it's always hard not to want to talk about everything. So I have to try to focus a little bit because, of course, there's much to say at this very interesting and challenging time for the world as a whole, for the world economy in particular. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the world economy. I'm an economist. I'm now working at Brookings as head of the Global Economics Program, and we look at the world economy. But then I want to go from the world economy really to the US and Turkey also. And I hope that I'll be able to create a link. I do believe the United States and Turkey have a lot in common. Of course, the United States is larger, more powerful, a bigger country. But when you look at the history as well as today and the future, and that's what I will try to touch on towards the end of my presentation, there are many commonalities, many dimensions, I think, which brings Turks and Americans together. Now, starting on the world economy, there's one PowerPoint slide, which I hope you can see, which is quite remarkable and which we don't often remember. And that is that modern economic growth, the fact that incomes go up, that countries become more prosperous, that people become more prosperous, is a relatively very recent phenomenon. I was at an event with Larry Summers, who, as you know, heads the President's National Economic Council. And he also started with this fact that people born 2,000 years ago and people born 200 years ago, for 18th century, basically the level of prosperity, the level of income was the same. Whether you lived in ancient Rome or whether you lived in the beginning of the 18th, 19th century in the US or in Britain, or for that matter in Istanbul, the actual living standards were quite steady. Growth started really with the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 18th century. There was a little bit, as you can see, there was a little bit of and unfortunately somehow the graph doesn't give the years here, but these are this is the 1,000, you can't really see it from the graph for some reason, but the fact is that for centuries until, and this is the 19th century is the second to last graph there, incomes were quite steady. So that's one thing that one has to remember, I think. And then what happened is a certain part of the world, basically Western Europe, joined by North America, started growing very rapidly. And this led to this explosion of per capita income that you can see at the end of this graph. And it did create, of course, a lot of inequality. This is an interesting set of figures. It shows you that in 1820, if you take the 10 richest countries and compare those 10 countries, the average per capita income in these 10 countries, to the poorest countries in the world. And when I say countries, because for comparison purposes, of course, borders and so on shifted. So it's really territories that we're talking about. The ratio of the richest to the poorest was 3. The richest countries were only 3 times as rich as the poorest countries. This ratio, as you can see from this table, increased steadily. It slowed down a little bit in the 1950s, but it essentially exploded. And at the turn of this century, in 2001, the ratio had become 47. The richest were 47 times richer than the poorest. And the richest were, of course, basically the West, Western Europe, the US, joined by Japan, as I will show later. So it was really the West and the rest. That led to a structure of the world where Europe and the US, again with Japan as a kind of, in a way, somewhat both interesting but strange addition coming from somewhere else, added to the rich. But it was a very unequal world, unequal in terms of power, in terms of income. And of course, because of the divisions in Europe, the wars, the First World War, the Second World War, Europe was always quite divided. And it really led, in the 20th century, to what many have called a unipolar world, where the United States basically dominated totally. That doesn't mean the US was ever able to do everything it wanted or to succeed everywhere. But there was no question that the center of power in the world was the US, that the richest country was the US, and that we had a world which was dominated by the US and Europe, with the US in a clear leadership position. Now, one of the points I want to make today is that we are witnessing over the last 20 to 30 years, but particularly over this last decade, a profound shift in the structure of the world economy. What was the 20th century is becoming something quite different. The crisis which the US and Europe particularly went through has accelerated that process, has made it clearer, but the process had started before. And what is happening is we have the emergence, particularly in Asia, of a group of countries led by China, but not just China alone, which for the first time is truly changing the structure of this world economy that existed at least during the 20th century. Others also are important. Brazil, for example, is growing rapidly, but not as rapidly as the Asian countries. Other countries are showing dynamism. My own country, Turkey, is a dynamic economy, is growing quite rapidly. I wish it was growing as rapidly as some of the East Asians. Not quite. Maybe we can accelerate. Now, the next graph I want to show you is the shares in total world income at market prices, and I don't want to go into technicalities tonight. I'm using market prices. Some people use purchasing power parity prices, but I won't go into that. And when you look at these shares, when you look at 1990, you see that emerging Asia had 6.6% of total world income in 1990, of which China had 1.7%, the US 25%. You can see Europe, the Eurozone rather, this doesn't include the UK, close to the US at about 24%. Just the US and the Eurozone together had about 50% of total income in 1990. Now when you look at 2010, which is today, you can see that emerging Asia has moved from 6.6 to 16. China alone has moved from 1.7 to 9. India, which was tiny despite the 1 billion people there, 1.2 has moved to 2.2, which isn't huge, but which is almost double of what it was in 1990. And you see the US is still kind of where it was in 1990, but there's one thing that I need to stress here. These numbers are in market prices, and therefore exchange rates play an important role. So it's not just the real GDP growth of the economies that are in play, but also the dollar versus the euro versus the yen versus the Chinese currency. So these are, if you like, at current exchange rates. And as you know, there's quite a bit of debate about the Chinese exchange rate, which is probably seriously undervalued. So then looking forward, and of course, economists are not infallible by far, as we have seen again in this crisis, but so projections are always a little bit tricky. But these are very conservative projections when it comes to Asia. And these are basically IMF projections that I'm using here, except that there are two columns. You can see 2020A and 2020B. 2020A uses the IMF methodology, which keeps exchange rates constant at their 2010 values. The IMF is not allowed by its board to project exchange rates in this framework. So if you use constant exchange rates, you can see that China goes to 15, almost to 16. Emerging Asia reaches the size the US has today. Europe loses, and you can see quite a strong transformation here. But if you actually make the modest assumption of a 2% a year gain in the Chinese exchange rate, which is very conservative, many economists predict that once the Chinese change their exchange rate policy, and of course there's lots of pressure on them, and we won't go into details, the Chinese renminbi will appreciate by more than 2% a year. But if you take the very conservative assumption of 2%, you can see emerging Asia going further to 26.5%, and China alone going to 17.7%. India also is growing. And you can see the US and Europe slowly, and Japan also slowly losing share. Now, what I want to stress here is that when you look at emerging Asia, the movement in 30 years from 6.6 to 26 minimum is unprecedented in history. We are going through a transformation which we have never seen before, of a kind that we've never seen before. There is one precedent, I'll come to it, but the scale of it is extraordinary. And I want to talk a little bit about that, and then, kind of try to share my views of what it really means for the structure of the world and also for global politics. Now, there has been one case in history that reminds one of this. And again, I mean, you have to, there are many numbers, many figures on this table. But I think the most dramatic one is the Chinese one from 1.7 to 17.7. I mean, it's mind-boggling. But there are other things, but the Chinese stand out, if you like. Now, there has been one precedent, which isn't, and that is Japan, between 1960 and 1995. you can see the Japanese share going from 3.3 to 13.3 to 17.8. Interestingly enough, the difference between 1990 and 1995 is entirely an exchange rate effect. What happened to Japan is it kept its exchange rate very competitive and kind of refused to revalue vis-à-vis the dollar for a long time. A little bit what China is doing today, to keep its export very competitive, to sell more in the world and all that. But then there was too much pressure, and Japan had to let its exchange rate appreciate. And that alone, despite the fact that growth actually stopped in Japan in 1990 for all practical purposes, led to a further increase in the Japanese share. And then you see that it, because of the other Asians emerging, and because of its own great difficulties in the last decade, and in fact the last 2 decades, it has again gone back quite dramatically, not back to 1960. So we have a precedent in history of a particular economy increasing its share very rapidly. But the difference between Japan and emerging Asia today is that Japan, at the end of the day, we're talking about 140 million people, roughly. It was a relatively small country joining the West, becoming part of the industrialized world. What is happening today with emerging Asia, and to some degree with certain other countries outside of emerging Asia, that we are really witnessing a complete restructuring of the world economy. It's no longer a country, a medium-sized country joining the US and Europe. It is the map of the world actually changing, and the center of gravity of growth shifting. I could spend the next half hour talking about reserves, talking about investment, talking about bank credit. The largest banks in the world now are no longer the US banks. They're increasing the Chinese banks, and so on and so forth. But we don't have time, and that's not really the topic. But what I want to suggest here is that we really are seeing an incredible shift. It will take some time for it to complete, and frankly, beyond 2020, I think all economists have to be careful with long-term projections. Who knows what will happen? It's not, it's hard to predict that. But the next 10 and maybe beyond 15, 20 years, I think there are some reasons to be quite confident that this transformation is going to continue and maybe even accelerate. And I'll touch on a few of these reasons very, very briefly. This is stuck? Oh, here it is. These are growth rates. Perhaps the last 2 rows are the ones to focus on. Again, there are too many numbers on this. But the last 2 rows, the 2.3 is the advanced country growth rate over the last pre-crisis period. The 6 is the developing country and emerging market growth rate. So we've had pre-crisis overall in the world a growth rate in the developing and emerging markets led by Asia, but not only Asia, that was 3 times as rapid as in the advanced economies of Japan, Europe, and the US. The US is still growing somewhat more rapidly than Europe and Japan, around 3%, whereas Japan is below 1 and Europe around 2. But the overall relationship, as you can see, is 6 versus 2.3. Something very different. Remember the inequality that I showed you when the West kind of took off and left everybody else behind. Now there's a massive catch-up taking place. I'm having trouble with the... Am I doing something wrong?
Is that right?
No, it has. Oh, yes, it has. Absolutely. Well, I hope I can do it. I mean, I have to just do it like that, right? Yeah, okay, fine. Now, let me just not use too many of these figures, but what is driving this catch-up growth? What is really happening? I think what's really happening are 2 things. One, technology, thanks to globalization, is much more easily exported and adapted than it ever was. So there is technological growth, there's a lot of inventive activity, and the US is still leading innovation in many ways. But with globalization, with the integration of the world economy, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, with the fact that China has become part of the global economy rather than resisting the global economy, technology can be imported, adapted, and used very rapidly across the world. So the technological advances in the Western world can easily be used and adapted by the developing countries and the emerging. So this technological diffusion has accelerated and is becoming much more easy than it was before. Particularly before the fall of the Iron Curtain, before the fact that all these emerging market and developing countries got integrated really into the overall world economy. In that sense, globalization, which kind of worked against the developing countries, is actually working for the developing countries in a sense. And they now have the institutions, the markets, the basic, with some exceptions of course, not everywhere. In parts of Africa are still having great problems, part of Central America, parts of Asia, but many of them have built the institutions and the capacities, the universities, the education systems that allow this import of technology. And of course it's easier to adapt technology than to use than to come up with a new invention. So that's what economists call catch-up in that process of technological innovation. But there's a second factor that makes this diffusion so powerful, and that is that the savings and investment rates in the developing and emerging countries are very high compared to the advanced countries. China actually saves more than 50% of its income. The US saves 15% overall, household, corporate, government taken together. These are the savings rate. And up there you have the average for emerging Asia. I think these things are quite big, so you may not see all the titles, but the 37.4 is the average savings rate of emerging Asia. Compare that to the US 14.9, I think it is. Sorry, what is it, 14 point? Yeah, 9. So you see the gap. So what's happening is not only is it easier to import technology, not only is the process of adaptation made much easier by modern communication technology, information technology, and so on, but the large parts of the emerging world, of the developing world, again led by emerging Asia, are setting aside a huge amount of their income to invest in the future and to accelerate this process of technological diffusion. So when you put these two things together, there are many other factors, but they fundamentally explain the differential growth rate and the fact that we now have this world economy that is getting much more differentiated with some of the emerging Asian countries leading it, but with others following, countries like Turkey, like Brazil, following in their heels. So this is kind of what I wanted to share with you. There are other figures, but I think I won't give too much of these. Oops. I give you one more interesting figure, and that is the current account projections. Current account in economist language are the excess of exports over imports. And you can see that these are projections, these are official projections by the IMF. You can see emerging Asia having a major export surplus. The Gulf, the oil countries, GCC are the oil countries of the Gulf also having a surplus, Japan having a small surplus, and the US, of course, had a big deficit, and the IMF continues to project that great deficit. So there is also a kind of overall trade imbalance, which adds to the story, which in a way reflects the excess savings, domestic savings of East Asia, and part of these excess savings are exported to mainly the US, some other parts of the world also, and do create a kind of imbalance in the growth process, which means that the Chinese and some of these exporting countries are accumulating more and more reserves. Chinese reserves have now reached almost $2.5 trillion, something again unheard of in history. But other countries are accumulating reserves. Russia is accumulating reserves. Brazil is accumulating reserves. India is accumulating reserves. And I think that the strength of their balance of payments is an added factor that contributes to this dynamic of catch-up growth, of much more rapid growth in parts of the developing and emerging markets. Now, of course, at the end of the day, this creates a lot of tensions also. It creates major trade tensions with the US. And there's another interesting feature here that I want to highlight. These are projections built up from the country desks of the IMF. So each desk kind of projects the future of trade in their countries. When you add it all up, the world cannot have either a current account deficit or a current account surplus, of course. We cannot run a surplus with outer space, or for that matter, a deficit with outer space, okay? However, interestingly enough, when you look at the world error term, and there are some statistical errors also, some genuine statistical errors, but in fact, what is projected here is an increasing surplus with outer space, driven by the export competitiveness and the desire to export of many of the developing and emerging market countries. Now, of course, this won't happen. There will be some factors that will make it adjust. And as I said, these are projected from the grassroots, if you like, from a country by country level. But it is kind of a funny part of these projections that this surplus with outer space. That's the background for what I really wanted to talk about. I just wanted to show you how the structure of the world economy is changing, how it's unlikely that this will slow down, at least not in the near future, because the factors that make it happen, mainly the very high Asian savings rates, their ability to invest twice as much as a proportion of their income than, for example, the US or Europe does, okay? And the fact that technology is so easy to export, to import, to adapt, to use, something that wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago. These two factors, I think, will make it certain, almost certain, that this process will continue. Some great political catastrophe, of course, mightn't happen if China somehow politically falls apart, or India. But if that doesn't happen, then I think these trends will continue at least for the next 10 to 15 years. Now, what does it mean? I'm done, actually, but anyway. So don't look at the figures anymore. So what does that really mean for the kind of world we live in? I think we're transiting to a world which cannot be as unipolar as it used to be. It will be definitely a world with different poles of growth, with more balance in power, financial power, economic power. Purely military power, I think the US is unequaled and will still remain unequaled for a long time. You know, for the foreseeable future, sheer military power will still remain unipolar, I think. But you know, with just military power, one can't do that much at the end of the day, as we can see from recent years. One can defend oneself, one can also, you know, it still is an important source of power. But if it's not combined with economic, financial power, political power, influence, and so on, it is only one dimension. I think it's still an important dimension, and the US here does not have any rival at this point, and probably won't have a rival, a serious rival, for quite a while. But in the economic and financial domain, we are moving to a much more multipolar world. Secretary Hillary Clinton calls it a multi-partner world, which I really like, because, you know, unipolar is kind of, by underlining the fact that it's multi-partner, she wants to underline, I think, very nicely, that these centers of power should be partners, not necessarily just competitors. There's an element of competition and an element of partnering in there. But I think the transformation is quite dramatic. And it will require a lot of adjustment on all sides, but particularly on the part of Europe and the US. One reflection of that adjustment has been the de facto end of the G7 and the emergence of the G20. As you know, there used to be the G7, then Russia joined as a G8 of the major industrial countries meeting once or twice a year at the leaders level and trying to coordinate world policies, world economic policies, world financial policies. The crisis ended that. It was actually President Bush who invited the G20 to Washington on November 15, 2008, and kind of said, we have to have the emerging market, the big emerging market countries, we have to have the Chinas, the Indias, and the Brazils of this world at the table now. I can't just sit down, you know, with the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of the UK, the Japanese, the Canadians, the Italians, and so on, and the French discuss the future of the world. The Chinese have to be here, the Brazilians have to be here, the South Africans have to be here, and so on. And then President Obama continued and had there was an extremely successful G20 meeting in London on April the 2nd, 2009. I actually went there with the Secretary General of the United Nations. And I think when we look back at the crisis and the history of the crisis, that meeting of the G20 in London and the measures they took in terms of stimulus packages around the world, by the way, the biggest stimulus package was the Chinese. In terms of relation to GDP, something like 3 or 4 times bigger than the US stimulus package. But it was a coordinated effort on the part of the G20. I think it sent the right signals. It sent the signal that the world leaders are on the task, that they will do what is needed to overcome the crisis, and it helped psychologically quite a bit in turning things around. And it really is March, April, May that we see the crisis diminishing and losing its virulence, and somewhat of a recovery starting, and then the recovery gaining force. And then there was another summit hosted by President Obama in Pittsburgh in September 2009 last year, which was the third of these summits. And at this point, the next one will be held in Korea in November, hosted by an Asian country, by the Republic of Korea. And it's just, I think, symptomatic. It reflects the fact that the world has become much more multipolar, that the rise of these emerging markets is so strong, I think is reflected in the role the G20 are now playing, the leadership role they're playing. Still, there are many things that haven't changed. The UN Security Council hasn't changed. The IMF and the World Bank are trying to reform and trying to rebalance voting rights in a very laborious way. But we just had the meetings actually in Washington last week of the IMF and World Bank governors. And again, there's talk about shifting more of the voting power to the emerging markets, to developing countries, moving the Chinese, I think, from 1.8 to close to 5. So this process is going on in the various international institutions with a lot of resistance, extremely strong resistance in the IMF and the World Bank, particularly from the Europeans. Not so much from the US, because in a way the US is not really overrepresented there, but the Europeans are overrepresented in many ways. They have 8 executive directors out of 24, compared to 3 Asians, and things of that sort. So this pressure is going on, and I think it will take some time, but it's happening. It's no longer resisted. Another major de facto agreement there is now is that the president of the World Bank and the managing director of the IMF will not necessarily be US citizen or European citizens anymore. This was, it was always a tradition. The head of the World Bank is an American, head of the IMF is a European. It is now quite clear. It's not yet written down, but there is an overall agreement that next time it will be open to everybody worldwide. So we have this globalized world that is becoming multipolar, multi-partner, we hope, and it is very different from what we had until the end of the 20th century. Now, what does it mean? Many of you must have read Samuel Huntington's book, and in Turkey it's of course a book very well known about the clash of civilizations. One vision about this world that is emerging, is a vision of regions, of centers based on civilizational, religious, geographic dimensions, but civilizational dimensions is the one that, these are the dimensions that Huntington really underlined, where you would have this multipolar world with the US, North America being one pole, Europe being another, and Huntington very much, of course, wanted the European pole and the US pole to continue to work closely together. The Chinese pole, Russia, the Muslim world was something that he had identified, and the Latin American Hispanic world, so to speak, and Africa also. But in Africa, of course, the development problems are still very challenging in terms of sheer power. It will probably take a while, but Africa is a very important part of the world also. But Huntington's vision, and many of you recall that, was really of these centers, of these regions, being quite antagonistic to one another. Not really a multi-partner world, but a multipolar world where history, geography, ethnicity creates these almost new super states that would compete with each other. And he singles out Turkey as a country in big trouble. Why? He says, well, some countries, he says, don't fit into this world. Some countries don't, you can't clearly say where they are. And he gives Turkey as the prime example of a country that wants to be in Europe but isn't really in Europe, is a Muslim country but has tried to be very secular, has these Turkic-speaking people in Central Asia going all the way into China, another area, is a great friend and ally of the United States for many, many decades now, but it's far away from the United States. So he says Turkey is in big trouble. Turkey is not going to be able to figure out into which category it falls, and there will be tremendous struggles inside Turkey between those who think of themselves as in the West and those who think of themselves the East, those who think of themselves Muslims, others feel as Europeans, and so on and so forth. So he singles out. Another country he says is in big trouble is Mexico. Because he says Mexico, well, it's of course a Spanish-speaking country, it's kind of in Latin America, but it's so much integrated with the US economy, it's part of NAFTA, the North American Trade Association, so free trade agreement, and so Mexico is not as bad as Turkey, but also a country kind of in trouble. Another one he also has problems with is Australia. Australia, a kind of white Anglo-Saxon country stuck in Asia. And so it doesn't quite belong there, and it's gonna be in trouble. So I want to liven up the evening a little bit, so I may be exaggerating a little bit, but this was really the Huntington's vision, and many people in a way subscribe to it. In Europe, there are many who say, well, Europe is a Christian kind of white place. Fought historically against the Moors and the Ottomans and the Russians on the other side. Doesn't really, the US was saved twice by, Europe was saved twice by the US, but many Europeans would like to put some distance, And so this idea of Europe as a kind of superstate, Huntingtonian superstate, is actually quite strong in the European project, according to some. And in the US, there are also those who feel that the US should, has its roots, its traditions, and will be a big superstate for the foreseeable future, and regard globalization with some suspicion. So there is this vision of these centers, of these superstates, if you like. Thinking of the 19th century nation state, these are nation state on a larger scale. In a way, the US has already been a nation state on a larger scale, but those who want to unify Europe under a kind of nation state formula, integrated fully, would in a sense want to follow the example of the United States. And it has some plausibility. I think it's also very worrisome, this vision. Because when we look at what happened in multipolar settings, I think there are many reasons to worry. In the 19th century, many bad things happened. There were little wars here and there. But broadly speaking, the United Kingdom, the British Empire, the empire, how do you say, where the sun never set, kind of dominated the 19th century. And then Germany rose, France became a little more powerful nation state, the United States, Russia, and so on. And the First World War, First World War period, was a period when you had quite kind of equal strength powers competing against each other. And when I'm not a historian, an economist, so I have to be careful. There are many better historians than I am here. But when you read how the world slid into World War I, it's very scary. Nobody wanted the war. There was no war party in a sense. Nobody said we're going to have a big war with each other. Countries were just trying to colonize people and competing in the colonies, trying to become a little more powerful than the neighbor. At the same time, the kings were cousins, many of them. I read this book which tells me that the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar, who were cousins, were actually planning a joint hunting party about 3 weeks before the war started. So it wasn't as if, the Second War was different. Hitler was aggressive, was planning a war, and he had to be stopped, But the First World War, the world slid into it without wanting it. It kind of happened, the Archduke got assassinated, the Austrians had to show something, some reaction, the Russians had to support the Serbians, the Germans had to support the Austrians, and then next thing you know, you had a devastating war with, up to 40 million people killed. So multipolarity can be very dangerous, can be very unstable. And therefore, the period we're entering now, I think, is full of dangers. Needs to be managed. The international fabric that holds the world together has to be strengthened. And I think one has to work against this Huntingtonian view of quasi-imperial regions competing against each other, and try to put forward a view that is quite different, a view of globalization that I think stresses many other factors in globalization. And in fact, that kind of globalization, in my view, can take strength, particularly in countries such as Turkey, but also such as the United States. Countries that are so multidimensional in their very fabric. The very countries that Huntington thinks have a problem could actually be the countries that bring the world together much more powerfully. And here let me just spend a little bit of time on the US and then on Turkey. When you look at the US, it's of course a very patriotic country, and it's one of the sources of strength and one of the wonderful things about the United States. But it has so many dimensions. It has African Americans, and we have had the wonderful event that 10 years ago many of us would not have predicted, of an African American being elected president. So there's an African American dimension in the US. There is, of course, a European tradition. Many immigrants come from Europe, but many immigrants now come from Asia, particularly on the West Coast. The links between the US and Asia are very, very strong. Cultural links, trade links, industrial links, links in the arts. There are ties to the Middle East. Jewish Americans are a very important component of American society, and there are these very strong ties to Israel. But increasingly, Arab Americans are also an important group. Their numbers are almost equal, and they will increasingly also play a role in the United States. So when you look at the United States, you don't see a kind of homogeneous super nation state. You see almost like a reflection of the entire world. The Hispanic population, Spanish mother tongue population, is becoming increasingly important. And as you probably know, Huntington's later book was very worried about that, because he felt that language, the English language, was very important, and he was worried about the role of the Spanish language in the future. One can debate that, and I think it is important to have a main language in a country that is the language of the state, so to speak. But I think we are all living in a situation now where we see Spanish taking on an increasing importance, and the links between the US and South America and Central America are becoming ever stronger. They're difficult links, immigration problems, many other problems, but at the end of the day, the dynamic is continuing and won't be stopped. So, as opposed to some of the European countries, I think the US is much more global, and in a way is much more linked to almost every part of the world. And in that sense is a natural leader for a process of globalization that does not divide the world into kind of neat categories, self-contained new nation states, but that sees the world as an interdependent family of nations and of peoples that you cannot easily classify. There is a Lebanese author, Amin Malouf, who has written a wonderful kind of autobiography called Murderous Identities, where he talks about Lebanon. Tiny little place, but with every identity under the sun there, almost. With little villages, Christian, Druze, Muslim, Sunni, Shia, and all that in a very, very, very small place. And he kind of tells in that book how when these identities try to become self-contained, try to turn onto themselves. They become murderous because they become aggressive vis-à-vis the other identities. On the other hand, he shows how everything is interlinked, how so many people have so many identities, and also how people choose their identities, sometimes exaggerate their identities when in fact their actual backgrounds are much more varied. My wife Kathy is very interested in these DNA so research that you can do, and they're amazing results. When people, through these DNA research, try to find out who their ancestors are, they come up with very strange things that they would never have suspected. So I don't know if some of you have done it, but we are all much more diverse in our backgrounds than we even realize. And now coming to Turkey. Turkey, in this context, I don't think can make a choice between Europe and the Muslim world, between Central Asia and the Middle East. The very history of Turkey, the makeup of the population, the way Turks behave and the way they interact, make Turkey, yes, a very diverse country, a country that is tied to Europe with very strong ties, historical ties, ethnic ties. Many Turks ethnically have Balkan origins, Eastern European origins. Others have been in Anatolia for a very long time. Others come from the Middle East. And then, of course, the origin of the actual Turkic tribes is Central Asia. But if you did, these DNA analysis in Turkey, you would find that people are from all over the place. In fact, there was one DNA study done in a Bulgarian village, in a Greek village, in a Turkish village. And the result was there was no difference. The DNA was exactly the same. You couldn't tell, any difference between Bulgarians, Turks, and Greeks. That's fact. That's not necessarily how people perceive it, but that is a fact. So, when we look also at borders, and particularly at the issue of Europe, some European politicians say, where are Europe borders? I want to know, I want to be told where my borders are. Okay? But borders are a very complex phenomenon, particularly in Europe. You know that there's the Eurozone. These days, Greece has reminded us that there is such a thing as the Eurozone. But the UK, which is part of Europe, is not part of the Eurozone. Turkey, which is not yet part of the European Union, has been in the European trade area, in other words, in the customs union, since 1996. Turkey is just a member of the trading zone as much as Italy or Spain. In fact, when the European Union negotiates a trade agreement with China or with the US, Turkey automatically adopts whatever the results are. Unfortunately, without being at the negotiating table, which is a little bit strange. You agree to something, if you agree to something, you should be at the negotiating table. But it's transition, we're being told, although the transition is now lasting for 15 years. When you look at the Schengen system, which is the joint immigration policy of Europe, when you have a Schengen visa, very prized product for many, because you can enter Europe freely. The Schengen borders are not the borders of the European Union. Again, the UK is not part of Schengen. Norway is, although it's not in the European Union. And other countries are still not part of Schengen. So when you think of defense, there are other issues here. There's a very strong defense cooperation, of course, within NATO. So for all practical purposes, the borders from a defense point of view of Turkey, Germany, UK, and the US are the NATO borders. Okay? So from a defense, you have a different type of border. And what I want to underline in that context is that the simple, we think of borders as very simple things. And of course, there is a US border and there's a Turkish border. I don't want to exaggerate. But for many economic, social, or military arrangements, you have different types of borders. And these different types of borders are going to multiply in the world. Turkey has just, over the last 2-3 years, opened its southern borders. It had already opened, as a European Union, most European Union citizens can enter Turkey without a visa. Greeks can enter Turkey without any visa at all. But now, many Arab countries don't need a visa to enter Turkey. And I think this has stimulated trade, has stimulated interaction, tourism, and so on and so forth. I don't think, I'm totally in favor of Turkey joining the European Union, but I don't think Turkey will ever close the borders again vis-à-vis itself. There's too much trade, too much activity, too much tourism going on. You can't do that. It would be taking a step backward. So in that sense, when we sit with Europe and negotiate, we have to think of these many types of borders. Now come to another country that I mentioned before, Mexico. Mexico, in terms of trade, is part of the North American trade zone, basically. So in that sense, the border, the Rio Grande, doesn't really exist for trade. And there may be, this whole immigration thing, I think, is a very difficult issue, of course, because there's unemployment and there's some crime issues and so on. But at the end of the day, I'm sure at some point the US and Mexico, not just Mexico, but probably other parts of Latin America, will have to come to some kind of an arrangement where the border is more flexible than, for example, vis-à-vis some countries that are far away and don't have the same kind of interactions. The interdependence between Mexico and the US is tremendous, and one cannot ignore it. In East Asia, China is beginning to build a big economic zone around itself. Many currencies are tied to the Chinese currency. There's the issue of the Chinese currency versus the dollar, but there is emerging a kind of East Asian currency zone, which will have a certain type of border, which is not the same border than you have for immigration or for defense issues. So the point I'm trying to make is that this world we're trying to kind of build will have to be a world where the borders are not very clearly defined, where you can belong to one part of the world in some sense and to another part of the world in another sense. The UK values tremendously, as you know, the special relationship with the United States. Same language, historical relationship, and the UK will never give up that relationship with the US. At the same time, I think the UK is part of Europe, part of the European Union, will remain so, even if the Conservatives form their own government. I think at the end of the day, the rhetoric is much more than the reality. There's no way that the UK will go outside the European Union. So if you're a British citizen, you have a very special link to the English-speaking world, you have a very special link to the United States, and at the same time, you're a European. If you're a Turk, you are part of the Muslim world. Vast majority of Turkish citizens are Muslims. You're very much linked to the Middle East by trade and by geography. You have strong links to Central Asia. But at the same time, I do believe conservative and progressive, religious or very secular Turks still want to be part of the European Union. Maybe they don't say it so openly. Maybe there's a lot of disappointment because the European Union has made it so difficult despite the major steps Turkey has made. But Europe still remains a national project. And I don't think, personally as a Turk, but I think most of my compatriots don't see this as a choice, but something that has to go together. So we have to functionally integrate in various ways. We may not integrate in the same way when it comes to migration and labor markets than we will integrate when it comes to trade or to defense. But I think this can be managed. And in order to manage this kind of world with more flexible borders, where you can belong, where you can have multiple identities, but that these identities are actually a source of strength and of progress rather than a source of conflict. We have to build a world which does not have the stark, if you like, antagonisms and contradictions that Huntington was projected. We have to accept that one can be an American, a Catholic, coming from a Hispanic background, and at the same time an environmentalist, a strong believer that climate change has to be fought. These are all different identities in the same person. Just like a Turk can be a Muslim, a social democrat, a European, all at the same time. And I think increasingly globalization will bring us to a world where this will become more possible, where naturally the forces of trade, of integration, of technology, of education, so many people are crossing borders for education and so on, will make this possible. However, I don't want to sound, and ending on this note, I don't want to sound as if this will necessarily be automatic or easy. I think there are other forces, forces of fear, forces of ignorance, of not really knowing what's going on, of uncertainty. The crisis has greatly also strengthened the sense of uncertainty. And it's very natural that many people don't really, how do I fit into this? And there is also the temptation to retreat to Amin Malouf's murderous identities, retreat onto oneself, fear of the world, fear of the other, and building an identity as against something rather than as something constructive and linking. And these fears are very strong. They're understandable, particularly in moments of economic insecurity. And I'm not a determinist. I think things could go both ways. The fact that the US is no longer the sole superpower and that China is emerging as such a strong pole of financial and economic power, and India will soon come with a population that will be even larger than China, could generate tremendous tensions. There could be tensions around nuclear proliferation, around trade, around exchange rates, around climate. These tensions need to be managed. And I think they need to be managed by strengthening the international institutions and the interactions that allow one to manage that. Turkey is now a member of the Security Council, not a permanent member, has worked a lot. For the first time, I think, is becoming a donor of foreign aid, is very active in Africa, is opening to the world. And I do believe the same is true for Turkey. Turkey should want a world where international cooperation is codified, where there is international law, where disputes can be settled in that framework. And particularly a country like Turkey that is in such a dangerous part of the world in many ways, where there's so much latent conflict, I think can benefit a lot from strengthening of these kinds of institutions in this kind of world. But to get there, I think fundamentally, and this is not the words of an economist, and many of you are more skilled, I think, in giving this message. I'm sure Jamil has many things to say on that, given his background. But we have to overcome this notion that people just belong into one kind of restrictive culture, that we have some kind of an identity that sets us apart from others. Of course we have identities, but we have many, many origins in these identities, and these origins overlap, as I said before. And if we view the world and globalization as a process where these overlapping identities work with each other, bring people together, build economic unions, trade alliances, monetary alliances, but not in a way where you're trying to exclude others, but where you try to be as inclusive as possible, I think we may be able to avoid the kind of world which unfortunately we saw in 1914 and which really destroyed large parts of the 20th century. In the 50s then, with US leadership, there was a bipolar world. In a way it was more stable, and then I think overall the strength and influence of the United States kept the peace in the world at some cost and with some exceptions. But now I think this is no longer going to be possible. It will have to be done in much greater cooperation with other powers that are extremely powerful, extremely wealthy, extremely economically dynamic. And so to manage that process, to create that world that will keep us safe and prosperous, I think is the biggest challenge we face in the 21st century. And I do believe that evening such as this and the work of the Istanbul Policy Center, which is exactly focused on this building of bridges between Turkey and the United States, but also between Turkey and the world at large, fits into that overall design and the overall objective. And that's why I was really very happy to accept the invitation. Thank you very much.
It was a fantastic overview of world economy, and you just connected nicely with the United States and Turkey. I think we are going to take some questions, but the interesting thing is that we are just identifying one topic for each year for Istanbul Center activities, and this year's topic was, who's my neighbor? Just knowing your neighbor, not only from a local point, but from a state point, national and international neighbors. And we were just emphasizing that. I think it just nicely fit in that framework. And I think we can take some questions from the audience.
China has a particular political system model that favors long-term horizon, long-term decision-making, and that may be a critical reason why China is growing so fast. I think that, and therefore, what are the lessons of that? I think it's an excellent question. It's much debated these days. It worries quite a few because, of course, those who believe in very vibrant participatory democracy see a system that is more authoritarian, although there is a lot of debate inside China, but clearly it is a more authoritarian system than many others. It may be, there's a lot of research and work done by economists analyzing political systems and the rate of growth. And the conclusions are not very clear, one way or the other. But clearly China is dominant. I mean, in terms of example of rapid growth, something you have to look at and think about. However, I would like to add that India, a country which is now population-wise the size of China, almost, and will soon be bigger than China, is not growing quite as fast as China, but almost as fast. The Indian growth rate this year is projected to be above 8.5%. This is at a time when in Europe will be lucky to make 2%, 1.5%. The US will be lucky if it's 2.5 or 3. And India is, of course, totally and sometimes disconcertingly democratic. There are X number of parties, coalitions, have to be formed. Nobody can ever win an election totally. You need always others to support you. And in that sense, while I totally agree with you that Chinese decision-making is rapid, and my Indian friends often tell me, when we decide to build an airport, it's a huge headache. We have to talk to the city, we have to talk to the people who live around, we have to talk to the various political parties, business associations. Chinese just say, we're going to build an airport, and they build it. Okay? However, I think the Indian example suggests that if you're a developing country, you can actually do extremely well while having all this democratic, negotiation process. So I think, it's a question that I don't have very strong answers, and the development economists as a whole don't have very strong answers. But for those of us who like democracy and like participation and like total freedom of expression and so on, India is an extremely interesting example. And coming back to my original point, well, what makes India different from quite a few other developing countries that are not growing so rapidly? India is saving 35% of its GDP. Turkey, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, is still below 20. Mexico is about 20. Okay? India, 35. So when you save as much, and therefore you have investable funds, then you can use this whole process of technological diffusion and technology imports much more powerfully and catch up. So, too long an answer to a very good question. I think, again, I don't want to say that the question, I don't want to disagree with you, because I think there's something, very correct in what you say, that quick decision, being decisive in decision making is important, and democracies sometimes have trouble with that. We see the US having quite a bit of trouble with decisive decision-making, because of the whole congressional process and all that. But at the same time, there are examples of very democratic countries in the developing world doing extremely well.
Perhaps beyond the political is a long-term issue.
Yeah. Well, that's a different. Yes, you're right. I mean, it may not just be the question of political system. It may be the individual values that determine savings, investment, and long-term thinking, which may be quite important. Yes. Well, I did bring up Japan as a precedent, and of course, Japan did then slow down. But Japan slowed down after it had almost reached pretty much US prosperity levels, income levels. China still is very far from that. China still has a huge amount of agricultural labor that can migrate to the cities and to the high productivity sectors in China. So the processes that make China grow still have a long way to go. Eventually, and that's why I said beyond 2020, 25, I don't want to project too much. But it may well be, and in fact, the whole process of technological diffusion and imitation will slow down once you've reached a certain level. But China or India or even Brazil are still very far from those levels. So they have a long way to go. If and when they reach income levels that are comparable to the most advanced countries, the difference with Japan, and I tried to stress that, is you won't have 140 million people having reached that. You will have 3 billion people having reached that. And that will that's why I'm arguing that the structure of the world will change. They will slow down eventually. I agree with you. There's no way that this catch-up growth can go on forever. They will slow down once Chinese income becomes 60, 70, 80% maybe of US income. Okay? But for that to happen, we still have quite a way to go. And because of their size, not just their size, China, India is another example, of course, it's different from Japan. Japan has reached the prosperity levels of the US or of Germany, but at the end of the day, it's a small country. Here you have 3 billion people heading in that direction. And I did actually check on the net export numbers. Out of the 10 percentage point growth in the Chinese economy over the last decade, net exports contributed 1 percentage point, which is not insignificant, but it's 1 percentage point. China is growing, and the current account, the surplus with the moon thing, tried to tell that story a little bit, but a big part of China is also domestic growth. And a big part of it is people coming from the agricultural rural area, very low productivity, moving into high productivity coastal areas, cities, and modern parts of the economy. And as long as that goes on, the average productivity will continue to rise. And because there are still 200, 300 million people in the very poor, backward parts of the economy ready to flow into the modern part, and because China is, of course, making major investments also in education, so you don't just have uneducated raw labor, but you have increasing number of technicians, engineers, and all that, I don't see the growth rate slowing down significantly. It may slow down from 10 to 8, but significantly over the next 10 to 15 years. Beyond that, it will slow down, but once they've reached that level, they will have a GDP that's already equal to the United States. So if you like, the multipolar structure will already be there. Then they will slow down. India will take more time. India is still far behind China in those sense, but it will also emerge in that way. That's at least my view. Who raised the point of sustainability. Now, sustainability, you meant more savings, but there is, of course, a sustainability in terms of climate and resources and environment, which for the Chinese is also a major problem. And again, if we don't do something about carbon, again, we can still, for 10, 15 years, go on like this, but then there will be other carbon-related issues maybe that come up. Now, in terms of the reactions against globalization, I think there are cultural and political dimensions of it, and there are purely economic parts of it. On the whole, I would say that, and as we see from the figures, the developing countries are now growing at an average rate about 3 times as fast as the rich countries. Okay? So from a developing country point of view, the more recent phase of globalization, the post-colonial phase of globalization, I think when we look at the numbers, has been favorable. It has helped many countries catch up, not all countries, not those who are unable to organize themselves or to have minimum decent governance, but many, many countries are able to catch up. And they're able to catch up because of trade, because of financial links, because of technology import, foreign direct investment, and so on and so forth. So I think, on the whole, one has to acknowledge that fact. It is also interesting that, of course, if you go to Asia, if you actually talk to Indians, Chinese, people from Singapore, Malaysia, and so on, you will find very little anti-globalization there. I mean, basically, they figured out that globalization is kind of working in their favor. Okay? Now, when it comes to the advanced countries, one could say that globalization doesn't seem to work in their favor, because the others, in some sense, in a broad sense, are doing better. Okay? And I think if one looks at these projections, which are not my personal projections, but IMF projections, it is clear that income is projected to grow faster in the developing countries than in the US or in Europe or in Japan particularly. Okay? So one could argue that, well, you know, is the US becoming worse off? And if you are worried about your distance to others, and if one is worried in any one country, or if Germans or, you know, French are worried about losing their preeminence, so to speak, one could argue, well, you know, they're losers of globalization. On the other hand, absolute growth can continue also in the advanced countries. At the time of the fastest growth in the US history, you know, at the end of the 19th century, when the US emerged with all the land and all the resources, was kind of 3%. We're still talking, if things go reasonably well with macroeconomic policies, if one can overcome the financial crisis, the US probably can still grow at 3%. So the fact that others are growing faster doesn't necessarily mean that the rich country citizens cannot advance themselves and improve their own prosperity themselves. However, having said that, if one looks at the US numbers, there are some worrisome dimensions. A recent study, and I'm afraid I don't remember the exact name, but you know, a recent, very careful study showed that in the first part of this 21st century, in the 2000 to 2008 period, 2/3 of all the increase of prosperity in the US went to 1% of the population. So while there has been overall progress, there are distributional problems in many countries which are quite severe, and particularly in the US. Scale, which is a good thing, and you know, with global scale, allows larger profits and larger returns to particular activities, also very good skills. If you're a great artist or tennis player or, you know, or football player or a great movie producer, you have the whole world as your market. And therefore the return you get on your own skill is higher than it used to be. Okay? So that if you like, that works in favor of high skills and highly skilled people, and it's often in some of the literature called winner-take-all economics. But there's also another factor, that unions have lost their strength, partly because in the old days, big manufacturing, big factories, you know, were the way the economy worked. Nowadays, it's much more technology, smaller groups, service sectors, the old huge factory, the Fordian kind of thing, is no longer what drives the economy. So the economy is much more segmented and atomized. And in that context, the strength of the labor movement has weakened significantly. The statistics show that until the early 80s, when productivity went up, wages went up. After the 1980s, an increasing gap has emerged between productivity and wages. An increasing amount of increased productivity is entirely captured by profits, by corporate profits. And then corporate profits translate into dividends and returns to a much smaller part of the population. And these are issues, of course. And then these, to what extent is it linked to globalization? Well, maybe to some degree it is, because it is true that US labor or French labor or German labor has to compete with Turkish labor, and now Indian labor, Chinese labor. Whereas capital, by being totally mobile, doesn't quite have the same problem. If labor was totally mobile, which it cannot be for all kinds of political and social reasons that are quite valid, it would flow to the richest countries and would equalize wages. But since labor is not as mobile as capital, by far less mobile, there is competition from lower income countries on rich country labor. That competition may not be extremely as strong as some people perceive it, but it exists. So I think these are real distributional problems that need to be faced. If this reaction against globalization, which is mainly increasingly based in the rich countries, can be managed. 20, 30, or 30 years ago, not 20 years ago, my memory is shortening. When I was a student, it was the developing countries that were totally against, globalization. Okay? In Turkey, particularly the left, used to say the common market is, they're common and they're common and we're the market. But this has shifted now. Increasingly developing countries are seeing that globalization is helping them. So in the rich countries, I think what needs to be managed is the income distribution. I think everybody gains at the end, can gain, but one has to put in place the distributional mechanisms that actually spread the gains. Because at the end of the day, while Chinese imports come into the US, of course, a lot of US exports will also go to China, creating jobs in the US. But when you look at the income distribution, it is quite clear that some have been doing much better than others, and in fact, the top rich have been doing extremely well. And in that context, and I have to say that a tax system and a public policy that tries to deal with this problem and tries to help those who are temporary losers or who are in particularly difficult positions is necessary. I think if it's just left to markets working on their own, we will have a very uneven distribution of the gain, the costs and the benefits, and one could get very legitimate resistance that could then snowball into much bigger problems that in fact tear the world apart rather than bringing it together the way I had tried to talk about it tonight. Is there a correlation between high savings rate and political systems? And that to some degree comes back to the first question, to some degree. The second question, is the European Union a kind of precursor, an example of kind of Huntingtonian superstates forming, and do we see other examples of this on the horizon? Now, on the first question, again, I'm going to give India as an example. India increased its savings rate from 20% to 35% in a totally democratic setting. So while there are examples of authoritarian countries with very high savings rates, there are also examples of really very democratic countries with very high savings rate. So I don't think that there is an easy or a type of correlation that essentially explains the process, okay? Second, well, the European Union kind of has tried to become a superstate, but those who had that vision of Europe in a way did not succeed. And I think that brings me back to and it's kind of nice that you allow me to end the evening on something I so strongly believe in. I was a member of the European Convention, which was the body convened by the European Union to draw up a European constitution. We were 2 Turkish members, one from the CHP, the Republican People's Party, myself, and one from the AK Party, Zekeriya Akçam. We were the 2 Turks there. We were invited, despite the fact that the president of the convention kept telling us, you'll never be a member of the European Union anyway. It was a little bit strange, because then why did he invite us, But that was the whole debate, what kind of Europe? And I think those who tried to build a kind of quasi-Huntingtonian Europe, and indeed some wanted to put in the preamble of the European Constitution that it was based on Christian traditions and culture. It was not accepted by the Convention because, while the European Union definitely has a majority of Christian, there are also Muslims, Jewish people, and other people, and people who don't, who are atheists in the European Union. So there was this search for a European identity, But the fact is, and I love Sweden, great place. I mean, it's one of the countries I admire the most, great social democratic country. But the way of life of a Swede is more distant, I think, from the way of life of somebody in southern Spain or in Greece than the Turkish way of life. Okay? So, or in the languages. One Greek politician once told me, she said, Kemal, in Europe, it's hopeless. With all these languages, we'll never make it. So in that sense, building such a kind of Huntingtonian superstate on such a diverse set of lifestyles, histories, traditions, languages, food. There was this big battle between the Italians and the Nordics about food at some point. I can't remember exactly what the battle was, but anyway. So it's very hard. Now that, to me, does not mean that Europe won't make it. So don't misunderstand me. I think Europe can make it as a great example, in fact, of multi-level 21st century governance that is in tune with globalization, provided it gives up this vision of being a superstate. It is a community of citizens, of regions, and of nations that do many things together, that have various borders depending on what you talk about, a monetary border, a trade border, a defense border, which are not necessarily the same, and which work on prosperity-enhancing and peace-enhancing projects, but without becoming a kind of superstate a la Bismarckian Germany. Bismarck unified the German Länder into a super state, and the French did the same, and the Italians and so on. That's not the European project that can succeed. Some people tried to make it like that, but that's not the Europe that can succeed. The Europe that can succeed will be multi-level, very complex. That's why I'm having trouble explaining it. But it is going to be very complex. And as I said, will fit into this world of other groupings, your other question, which will be a little bit of the same nature. Mexico will be in a free trade association with the US, maybe one day in a common market, but will be part of Latin America also, will belong to both the North American and the South American worlds. Australia will be very Asian. The Chinese are buying huge amounts of industry there, of land. They're part of the East Asian economic zone, if you like, but will of course be very much linked to the English-speaking world and to the US. So this kind of multi-level world with complex borders and multiple identities is, I think, what's going to happen, and also what I think should happen. It is not replicating the 19th century nation state, at a continental level. And let me say one last thing about Europe. Despite its problems, despite what's going on in Greece now, it's a fantastic success. It has generated peace in a part of the world which has torn itself apart for centuries. It may not be the world's most dynamic economy, but it's very prosperous. Again, I think if very poor people in Asia are getting richer, it shouldn't be a reason for the very prosperous people in the US or in China to be upset, provided that we can, in the West, if you like, maintain our prosperity or even increase it somewhat, let the others grow faster. The question is, how do we manage that? How do we manage a world where, yes, some countries are going to grow much faster, but where citizens in the more advanced and mature industrial economies, of course, want to preserve their prosperity? And let me be a little bit emotional at the end, since our Prime Minister is visiting Athens next week. I was in Turkey when I was in the government, and there was a big 1,000 participants were there, conference of young entrepreneurs in Europe. And they asked me to do the keynote speech. And so I wanted to start, and I said a few words, but all of a sudden I had two lady participants stand up, who felt also as emotional and enthusiastic, I guess, as I did. And one of them, they held each other's hand, and one of them said, "I'm French and she's German, and we're in peaceful Europe together forever." And I thought that was a fantastic message, to give in Istanbul. And despite the fact that I believe Turkey should develop its links with the South and with the East, I do hope that Turkey will also be part of that kind of Europe. And I think I can already see it happening. There will be a Turk and a Greek standing up and holding each other's hand and say, "We are together in Europe forever." Thanks a lot.
very much.